Thank you all for having me here. It's very bizarre to be back here. None of this was here when I went here. So I had a moment where I was like, I should go check out the cross-cultural center. And it's like, I don't know if I can find my way back, actually. So that's for another day. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge that we are on unceded Kumeyaay land and that this talk talks about settler colonialism and decolonization, and that we need to have really a global perspective on what that means. And we need to sort of think about how our own everyday existence continues to feed into these systems that dispossess people of their land and lives. All right, so I'm gonna give a brief overview of what I'm gonna be talking about today. So I'm gonna be talking about sort of network destruction in Gaza since October 7th, 2023, and then sort of scale or look backwards and looking at digital colonialism in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, pre-October 7th. And then I'm gonna look specifically at some mapping projects to think about the question, who does design serve? All right, so on October 7th, 2023, Palestinians in Gaza broke siege and entered Israeli space. In the first coordinated Palestinian offensive since the Second Intifada, Gazan fighters advanced through air, water, and land, killing 1,200 Israelis and taking 250 hostages. What followed this incursion was the predictable cycle of Israel's collective punishment of the Gaza Strip, which is a 139 square mile piece of land that's often called the world's largest open air prison because 2 million Palestinians live in that space and have done under siege and blockade since 2007. A key tactic of Israel's bombardment of Gaza is the severing of Palestinian communication networks. So on October 9th, Israel bombed Palestinian telecom infrastructure in the Al Rimal neighborhood of Gaza City, triggering network outages throughout the Strip. The next day, airstrikes destroyed 2 of the 3 main fiber optic lines that connect Gaza to the outside world. Simultaneously, Israel prevented the entry of fuel into the Strip, resulting in the shutdown of Gaza's sole power plant. The fuel embargo led to a cessation of 60% of telecommunications network electricity. The decimation of infrastructure and Israel's fuel blockade were understood widely as precursors for the ground invasion of Gaza on October 13th. Ever since October 13th, thus began the periodic sustained telecoms outages that still plague Gaza at the time of writing this essay over 18 months into the genocide. By the end of October 2023, 15 of the 19 telecoms providers in Gaza fully shut down, with the 4 remaining networks experiencing regular interruptions that lasted up to a week. Reports from humanitarian organizations in January 2024 found that 80% of the ICT sector, 75% of mobile and fixed communications networks, and almost all warehouses and telecom operator facilities were damaged or destroyed. In late January 2024, international groups assessed the damage to ICT infrastructure as exceeding $90 million. So the Israeli attack on telecoms infrastructure must be understood as a tactic of terror that facilitates the enclaving and genocide of the Palestinian population. So since October 7th, main network providers Paltel and Jawal have reported over 10 network blackouts that preceded or accompanied upticks in Israeli offenses. So despite cutting Gazans off from the internet, the Israeli military used its Twitter account to direct Palestinians to so-called safe zones, which, as we read, were never really safe zones. Gazans then turned to radio stations to keep abreast of the changing, confusing directives that the Israeli army issued. However, Paltel reported that nearly 60% of its radio sites were lost by October 21st, 2023. A week later, only 1 FM station remained operational in Gaza. And since mid-November of 2023, all FM stations in Gaza are off air. So there's a coordination of telecommunications cessations, military incursions, and blockades of fuel into Gaza since October 7th. And this is the reason why the human rights group Access Now argues that telecoms blackouts are being used as a tactic for maximum damage upon the population. So this is one of the social networking posts from the provider Paltel said, "Keep Gaza connected." And in Arabic, it says, "Gaza is proud and will live until the dream is realized." So Israel's assault on telecommunications infrastructure expands beyond the destruction of cell towers, fiber optic cables, data centers, and fuel supplies that power towers and field facilities. And it also includes the targeting of human infrastructure. So telecoms workers in Gaza increasingly risk safety to restore network connectivity. In December 2023, 2 Paltel technicians were targeted and killed by the Israeli military after repairing cables in Khan Yunis. Along with a surviving colleague, Nader Abu Hajjaj and Baha al-Rayes were evacuating via a pre-approved route that Paltel had arranged with the Israeli Defense Forces when a tank opened fire on their vehicle. Abu Hajjaj and al-Rayes are 2 of at least 16 Paltel technicians that have been killed since October 2023. Additionally, Palestinian reliance on non-traditional methods of network connectivity amid the shutoffs has exacerbated the precarity of these so-called human routers. So many Palestinians use eSIMs, or electronic subscriber identity module cards, that provide access to a cellular network. So some of you may have heard of this. However, you need a network connection to initially even download the eSIM. So human routers set up wireless hotspots so other people can download donated eSIMs. So Myrna El-Helbawi, who is the founder of Connecting Gaza, who's led a lot of these initiatives about donating eSIMs, she explains that her organization often loses communications with their on-the-ground counterparts, only later to find them amongst the list of Gaza's dead. So the restoration and connectivity services network technicians and human routers provide are necessary for Gazan survival. Without network access, paramedics and relief agencies cannot respond effectively to emergencies, thus putting even more people at risk. So by mid-November, as some of you all might recall, half of all aid groups present in Gaza ceased their operations, in large part due to infrastructural limitations and the targeting of aid workers by Israeli Defense Forces. So Gazans increasingly risk safety to contact emergency services, to receive information, and just to check in on their family. In February, a group of Palestinian men were attacked by a quadcopter drone armed with a rifle as they sought cell service. Because eSIMs often cannot receive signals from cell towers, Gazans risk increased visibility and precarity to climb atop of buildings in the hopes of connecting to the outside world. Euromed Human Rights Monitor argues that Israeli soldiers target Palestinians that are searching for connectivity. They explain that, quote, "The IDF particularly targets civilians trying to pick up communications and internet signals in besieged areas where serious human rights violations are occurring," end quote. So Euromed speculates that these attacks on Palestinians that are looking for network signal is in part to prevent Gazans from reporting human rights violations that are happening on the ground. Others have been killed by the IDF while searching for cell signal to connect with family or to issue pleas for aid to the international community. So we need to think about this as a type of psychic violence as well. It's not just physical violence, but there's a psychic violence of network destruction, because Gazans are living with a constant threat of death while being cut off from emergency services, and they're uncertain whether their family and community members are safe and have no way of checking on them. So Israel cuts off flows of information through limited communication networks, but also through the targeting of press. So over 130 journalists have been killed since October 7th. And amidst the increasing vulnerability of journalists and the destruction of telecommunications infrastructure, Palestinians and international reporters take to micro-vlogging sites as full crews reporting in Gaza has also become untenable. So while Gaza's infrastructure suffered devastation, online social media platforms exacerbated the severing of Palestinians from the outside world. Social media sites employed a variety of tactics to quash any sort of pro-Palestinian discourse, including shadow banning, deplatforming, and failure to rein in disinformation campaigns. Palestinian news networks rely heavily on Facebook for dissemination, and Meta banned several, including Al-Quds News Network on October 21st, which again deprives Palestinians from another source of information. That same day, TikTok also banned Mondoweiss, which is a left-wing Jewish publication that was reporting on Israel's offensive in Gaza. Around that same time, Meta also reported a bug that translated the Arabic word for Palestinian into terrorist in English on Instagram. They said that this was just a bug that they dealt with. In the second week of October, the Arab Center for Social Media Advancement tracked 23,000 posts on X in Hebrew and found 19,000 of the posts to be engaging in hate speech or inciting violence against Arabs and Palestinians. So this is just 1 week after October 7th. Across all social media platforms, Palestinians and their allies face barriers when sharing information and analysis. So these platforms additionally thwart the aspirational promise of networks amidst violence, that connection with global community can somehow prevent further devastation. So network interruptions serve two parallel purposes: separation and severing. So separation refers to cutting Palestinians off from Israelis and also the global population. And severance adds another dimension, that of internal separation that cuts Palestinians off from each other. And I borrowed this term, inqisam, from Liran Moore. So to understand the implications of separation and severance, let's consider these statements from Gazans in the aftermath of October 7. So Noor Ashur says, "I was afraid that once the internet connected again, I would hear the names of people we know who were martyred. Every minute since the moment the network connected, we hear the news of another person's martyrdom and grieve them. I wish the internet had remained disconnected." Maha Hussein says, "Don't tell me about horror until you Google your friends and family members' names, and their phones are unreachable, hoping to not find them amongst the list of victims in the ongoing Israeli bombardment." And Rana says, "When Israel cut off communications, we cried and wailed. That's it, they've killed them all." So these three quotes presented here illustrate how important communication network is in both the execution of and the mitigation of severance. So there's an emotional association of information and communications infrastructure with death and destruction as technology transmits news of Gaza's devastation. So Ashur laments Gaza's martyrs, and in her quote, "The network itself is what brings death," in which Palestinians without the network can exist in this indeterminate state. We don't know if our family members and our friends are dead or not. But as soon as we have network connectivity, then we know who is dead, right? So the network is what brings death. So Rana, however, thinks about severance from communication networks as death. So it's the silence that is death rather than the presence of the network connection, right? So she thinks about the blackout, and he says the blackout, that's it, they're dead. They've killed them all. So both having connection and not having connection function as tools to segment and sever Palestinians from each other. And we can talk about how this actually goes back to the Nakba in 1948, where news of massacres was a way to also terrorize Palestinians into leaving their homes. So both, again, having connectivity and not having connectivity both work to psychically and physically cause violence amongst Palestinians. So again, blackouts prevent contact with dead air standing in for Palestinian lives lost to military incursions that accompany network cessation. But communication also makes tangible the death and devastation of Gaza's population. So for Palestinians, open lines of communications can be harmful in different ways that are no less devastating than having communication blackouts. So in Husseini's figuration of the network, the mass audience of online death announcements mitigates some of the elements of severance. So Palestinians who are unable to contact loved ones for a range of reasons, so this could be network blackouts or dead batteries or actual death. In the absence of constant contact, martyr lists provide information on the likelihood of survival and safety. However, statistics reported by the Gaza Health Ministry are incomplete, as we know, as those still buried in the rubble and unidentified retrieved bodies could number upwards of 20,000 in some estimates. So connectivity and information flows can only partially mitigate the severance between Gazans that Israel imposes. So more broadly, these quotes gesture to the indeterminate potential of new media and digital technologies within the context of settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and diaspora. ICT is leveraged by, for, and against Palestinians. I think this is really important to think about because sort of in this techno-utopian discourse that we hear is that actually connectivity makes everything better. And I think these quotes sort of demonstrate that connectivity on its own is not enough, right? Okay, so I'm gonna step back a little bit and sort of talk about what Gaza and the West Bank's communication networks look like prior to October 7th. So it's important to understand that these tactics that Israel has been using since October 7th are not new. So since before October 7th, Palestinians have been subjected to contact with technologies of surveillance and death. But they've also relied on new media to connect scattered populations to sustain a diasporic identity. So as such, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza occupy a strange place in the rhetoric of the digital divide, which some of you might have heard of, right? So the digital divide is like some people have the internet and some people don't have the internet. And that situation is always more complicated than that, but it's especially complicated for Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank. So as this graphic shows, that Palestinian airspace is occupied by Israeli satellites, by unmanned air vehicles, and by assault helicopters. Borders and checkpoints house biometric technologies. Israeli soldiers surveil Palestinians with night vision goggles and surveillance systems that are installed around illegal settlements. So in other words, Palestinians have to deal with a lot of technology in their everyday lives. And these are not technologies that are kind to Palestinian bodies. At the same time, scholars like Helga Tawal-Suri explain that Palestinians rely on social networking sites like Facebook and apps like WhatsApp to connect with family and friends that they've been severed from. So the Palestinian experience in relation to digital and technology and new media can be characterized as a form of colonialism in itself. So a form of digital colonialism or digital apartheid. So in the case of Palestine, there's a contemporaneous codification of deterritorialization and the de facto establishment of digital apartheid, which is a very complicated sentence that I wish I'd edited before I said it out loud. So what that means is basically between 1993 and 1995, the Oslo Accords brokered an agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. So part of these agreements, which were broadly outlined path to Palestinian self-governance, was the overdue allowance of Palestinians to build ICT infrastructure. So Article 36 of Annex 3 mandated that Palestinian access to the, quote, electromagnetic sphere, and it legislated that Israel should work to connect the telecommunications networks of the Palestinian territories until an alternative Palestinian infrastructure and service had been established. So the Oslo Accords were imagined as this 5-year interim plan that would precede the establishment of clearly demarcated independent Israeli and Palestinian states. So instead, what happened was the continuous eroding of Palestinian sovereignty by Israel. At the time, the occupied Palestinian territories were divided between the West Bank and Gaza, as you can see in the first map, with East Jerusalem having been annexed by Israel in 1967. So the splintering of land and populations was furthered by the division of the West Bank into 3 different areas, which is what this graphic shows. So area A, B, and C are all subject to different jurisdictions. So 18% of the West Bank became Area A, and this fell under the control of the Palestinian Authority. Area B made up 22% of the West Bank and fell under Palestinian civil control, but joint Palestinian and Israeli security control. And Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, was under full Israeli control. So if we're thinking about the negotiations about telecommunications infrastructure, it meant that these different jurisdictions determined what networks could be established within those spaces. And I'm talking about, this is phone lines, let alone internet infrastructure. So what the Accords did is that they reaffirmed the relationship between the Palestinian territories and Israel as one of both technologically facilitated exploitation and paternalism through ICT infrastructural development. So there was an uneven relationship between Israel and the Palestinian territories that evolved in response to Oslo, in which Israel controls almost all of Palestinian infrastructural development. So a lot of the accords are critiqued for leading to a symbolic recognition by Israel, but not much else. And that's the case when it comes to ICT infrastructure as well. So Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza face numerous difficulties stemming from compromised sovereignty and access to infrastructure. So for example, Israel refused to release frequencies to allow Palestinian cell providers like Wataniya to operate in the West Bank for over 7 years. And Israel continues to refuse to adhere to the accords, and this affects what Palestinian infrastructure looks like today, including the fact that Israel has prevented the installation of 3G networks in the occupied Palestinian territories until 2018. And up until this 18-month era of the genocide, 2G was standard in Gaza. So these are very slow networks. That means that connection is going to be very untenable. And that means that pictures, news, and images are very hard to get out. So Palestinians lack access to ICT. And this ICT is talked about as a way to negate distance and make geography irrelevant. So many of you are too young to remember sort of the rhetoric around the internet, but it was all about how there's no borders anymore and everybody can connect with each other. And we can see here how Palestinians are left out of that conversation. They're denied full access to technology that allows for diasporic connections under apartheid, but at the same time, Palestinians are subjected to technologies of violence and death. So in the context of Palestine, the use of technology can be understood as politically ambivalent and contradictory. There are fraught, paradoxical, and juxtaposing implications of Palestinian encounters with technology. Many encounters with technology and networks are violent, but some are restorative. All right, so what have we discussed so far? I need this mostly for myself. So the first TLDR is, firstly, network destruction is a strategy of separation and severance designed to enact maximum damage on Gaza. The second point is that network destruction includes the destruction of infrastructure, both human and non-human, killing those who seek network connections, targeting members of the press, and collaborating with social networking sites to silence Palestinian voices. The third point is that the limitation and destruction of Palestinian networks has been a tactic of Israeli control since long before October 7, as exemplified through the Oslo Accords. And finally, Palestinians are subjected to technologies of death and surveillance, while they also rely on sometimes the same technology to sustain diasporic and exilic networks. Let us now consider the potential for digital technology to either undercut or support Palestinian agency and sovereignty by looking at a few mapping projects of Palestine. So unfortunately, I'm going to start with something that is bad. My students have told me in class, your classes are really depressing. I'm like, I'm sorry, that's just who I am inside. First, we are going to talk about some proprietary mapping projects of Palestinian territories. So on Monday, February 29th, 2016, 2 non-combatant members of the Israeli Defense Forces drove through the West Bank town of Colonialism, which is a refugee camp for internally displaced Palestinians that was established in 1949 by the United Nations. Using the smartphone navigation application Waze, the soldiers stumbled into the camp after forgetting to enable a setting that avoids dangerous or prohibited for areas that are dangerous or prohibited for Israelis to drive through. So camp residents pelted the armored vehicle with stones in an attempt to run the soldiers out of Palestinian territory. The soldiers followed military protocol and they opened fire on the Palestinian residents of the town, fatally shooting 22-year-old student Iyad Omar Sajadiya in the head. Much of the coverage following these clashes centered about why these soldiers were using Waze rather than a physical map that's provided by the military. Israeli Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner condemned the use of this app, saying they should be using maps. They should know the route already. So this isn't the first time that navigation issues were blamed for Israel trespassing into Palestinian-controlled lands. So in 2015, 2 IDF soldiers were navigating to a military base called Beit Lid, and they found themselves in a Palestinian town that has the same name. In October 2016, 4 off-duty soldiers were extricated from the West Bank area north of Hebron while en route to natural springs nearby, which led to an IDF investigation into similar accidents. So if applications like Waze don't have an intended user base of soldiers, they definitely don't have an intended user base for Palestinians. So Palestinians are not banned from using Waze, but their exclusion from Waze is implicit, since users must have access to a smartphone, a data plan, and a robust telecommunications infrastructure, which, as I just demonstrated, is rare. So even if Palestinian users are able to overcome structural barriers to access, they are faced with further limitations due to incomplete geographical data. So when a Waze user inputs a destination that crosses into Palestinian-administered territory, frequently the application cannot find a route to provide. Often the routes that are provided are not safe for Palestinians to use, as they are excluded from Jewish-only roads, and they must take routes that navigate them through Israeli checkpoints. Furthermore, Waze's default safety features allow users to avoid dangerous driving areas in the A and B territories prohibited by law for entry by Israelis. So if a user decides to disable this safe mode, as the Israeli soldiers who entered into Colombia did, Waze prompts a confirmation. Are you sure? Removing this setting will route you through forbidden and dangerous areas. So this default safety measure imagines a civilian Israeli user base. There are options on Waze for Israelis to avoid Palestinian-administered lands, but there's no settings for Palestinians to avoid settlements or checkpoints or Jewish-only roads. So on Waze, freedom of movement is the commodity of the Israeli traveler, and not Palestinians who are limited by Israeli control. In 2017, Waze actually collaborated with Israeli police and military to include more Palestinian-administered areas onto the platform. So this was done as a response to that IDF investigation that said, why are all of our soldiers getting lost? So they thought if we map more Palestinian areas, then maybe they won't get themselves into situations where we need to get them out of Palestinian-controlled areas. So I just want to make clear that this discourse of error and accident has historically been used by Israel to make Palestinian death acceptable and actually a constitutive part of state policy. So, for example, we've heard of the accidental killing of the World Central Kitchen aid workers, or the accidental targeting of children and families. So each Palestinian death serves Israel's ethnic cleansing practices, whether that death is premeditated or accidental. In other words, if we can blame errors on the Waze app for Sajadia's death, then we can also blame accurate maps and navigation software that's used by the IDF for the death of Palestinians. So it doesn't matter that the app is more accurate, regardless of whether or not an Israeli soldier accidentally enters a Palestinian town or purposefully does it, the same result happens. Palestinians are killed, right? So Palestinians have limited access to digital maps that they are not the intended users of. So these maps don't give accurate information to Palestinian users, or also they can use Israeli names of Palestinian geographies, or they don't take things into account like checkpoint wait time. So if you need to route, how do I get from one place to another? How early do I need to leave my house? Well, the apps will not tell you how long it takes to cross a checkpoint, right? Okay, so for the last section of the talk, I'm gonna briefly talk through a few different mapping efforts that are initiated by Palestinians. So as we discuss these projects, let's think through these questions. So who are digital tools designed for? How can digital projects elevate Palestinian voices and facilitate Palestinian agency and sovereignty? So the first project that I'm going to talk about is Azma, or traffic jam in Arabic. And it's one of a few different apps that allow Palestinians to identify checkpoints that need to be crossed during travel. So users can add information, including wait time and if a checkpoint is closed that day. The app was first created in 2015, and it was designed to run on slow networks, but it was soon taken offline after the developers received threats from the Israeli military. So in 2023, they found another backer and have been online since June of that year. And the app developers have actually been struggling with high demand and the sheer number of checkpoints that need to be added to their maps. The developer said, we thought we'd have 100, maybe 200, but we need 450 just in one particular area of Jerusalem, right? So they're having a hard time getting their app to be accurate because there's so many users that want to use it, and there's so much. So this effort was initiated to transform the relationship that refugees have with the spaces that they inhabit. So maps of refugee camps in Lebanon tend to be classified documents. And this sort of perpetuates the idea that the camp is just something that receives aid from the government, and it doesn't have a population that is living and thriving within it. So this was an effort to reclaim agency over the space that refugees have been forced into. So mappers took 5-foot wide bright red balloons with attached cameras and flew them over the camp. The device snapped aerial images for the purpose of locating water sources, identifying sites for future public projects, marking community resources, and mapping micro-communities within the camp. So mappers looked at the footage to find space available for public use and planting greenery. Refugees became city planners and exercised sovereignty in the camp. And the camp's density and sprawl are mitigated through mapping. So people in the camp were saying, like, we actually don't know how big this camp is, because a lot of time in refugee camps, people are sequestered into areas that are demarcated by which village they are fleeing from, right? So if you're all fleeing from the same village, then this part of the refugee camp is designated for your use. So there was actually kind of internal division within the refugee camp where people didn't know people from other villages. And this was one project that helped them kind of look at what does this refugee camp look like and where are there smaller communities within it. So this mapping effort marks a collaborative use of technology between refugees and international actors to respond to and improve Palestinian life. The mapping tools were also chosen really deliberately to avoid mimicking Israel's high-tech tools of suppression. So they didn't use drones on purpose. They used a balloon with a camera on purpose because they didn't want to freak people out who were looking up and saw this thing taking pictures of them. So this is one example of how technology is used to create tangible and incremental change for Palestinian life. The project is also easily replicable without reinforcing asymmetric power relations between camp residents and outside actors, as Palestinians don't need to rely on grants and donations to cover the costs for this kind of mapping effort. So this project is born out of an awareness of Palestinians' exposure to technologies of control and limited access to personal technology. The last project that I'm going to discuss is the Palestine Open Maps project that archives contemporary and historic spatial data on Palestine. So over 2,000 Palestinian sites are available on the website. Users can look at historical and current maps side by side, or you can overlay these maps to see how topography and site names have changed. So also available are links to interviews that are housed on other archives. So for example, on this page for Lidda, there's an interview linked that is housed on the University of Beirut's Palestine Oral History Archive. And this interview with Ismail Abdelkader Shammout is linked because he was born prior to 1948. So this project is a collaborative effort between individuals and organizations like the Visualizing Palestine team that made that beautiful infographic that I showed you earlier, Also, Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture has a hand in this project. The Israeli human rights group Zochrot is also involved, and the online archive Palestine Remembered. So it uses data that's drawn from a variety of sources, including also, weirdly, the Israeli and Australian National Public Libraries. So it's kind of aggregating all of this information that lives in different places on the internet and putting them onto one map. So users can look at information and see how the land has transformed. All right, so returning to the questions that I posed earlier in this talk, each of these Palestinian-led mapping projects centers Palestinian needs, whether in Jerusalem and the West Bank, in a refugee camp in Lebanon, or in diaspora. We can see how, in direct contrast to the types of violence enacted by Israel upon Palestinian bodies and networks, these technologies facilitate Palestinian agency and sovereignty by acknowledging and centering socio-political questions rather than flattening the landscape of Palestinian technological development as a depoliticized issue of access or development. Okay, so the final TLDR. So first point, Palestinians are subjected to cyber colonialism. The second point, infrastructure follows lines of Israeli control. Thirdly, social media platforms punish Palestinian users and content. Fourthly, none of this is new post-October 7th. And then finally, Palestinians use and create new media and digital technologies to reassert indigeneity and community. Thank you.